Hi everyone. Before we get started, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining this meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that same respect to the custodians of the land wherever you might be joining the meeting from. Today we've got a very interesting presentation from Marty Ridden-Smith, who has recently completed their PhD with the Department of Anthropology at UCID. I'll let you take it away, Marty.
Thank you. I will just share my screen with PowerPoint. Okay, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm calling in from, which are the Gaiabal and Jarowair people. Can everyone hear me okay? I think my internet connection is a little bit unstable sometimes. Okay, great. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I did my research, which are the Gugu Yimadir, Kuku Taipan, and Lama Lama people, and Okla people of Southeast Cape York. So this paper is based on my doctoral thesis, which examined how a diversity of people in Cape York Peninsula, far north Queensland, have come to belong in meaningful ways to land and how they relate to other co-residing people and non-humans in the region. My research is based on 14 months of ethnographic fieldwork carried out between 2018 and 2019 in Southeast Cape York. My field research was multi-sided as I followed the networks of the people involved in different and overlapping land areas in the southeast region of Cape York. The sites include the towns of Cooktown, Hopevale, Laura, Cohen, Port Stewart Yinjinga, as well as Renuri National Park, Lama Lama National Park, and a number of cattle stations adjacent or close to those parks. In my research, I have followed anthropologists Francesca Merlin and Åsa Ottosson in taking an intercultural approach. That is, while it is vital to detail and analyse historically shaped cultural differences and forms of inequality that enable and constrain how particular groups of people can access and belong to land in a particular region, it is also important to recognise and investigate those ways of connecting to and managing land that overlap and are partially shared across such differences. My research embraces different categories of Cape York residents working with and on the land, including Aboriginal traditional owners, non-Indigenous graziers, and Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service rangers. These people have varied experiences of the land through a mix of physical labour, asset ownership, ancestral connection, traditional ownership, kinship, native title, and various responsibilities attached to their employment in the land management sector. Anthropologists typically foreground the lives and socio-political conditions of subaltern and culturally marginal groups. Much of the anthropological scholarship in Cape York has done just this, providing rich and important accounts of the distinctiveness of Aboriginal life worlds, cultural practices, and political struggles. However, there are also important commonalities among the Cape York land managers. They must all interact with the non-human elements in the landscape, such as weeds, cattle, fires, and monsoons. My analysis strives to extend our understanding beyond presumed socio-cultural boundaries by attending to the relational and intercultural processes through which Cape York residents come to value, care for, and secure a livelihood in the changing environment. Significantly, I find that the values, priorities, and practices of these groupings are not necessarily oppositional in an Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal binary, but they converge and diverge to varying extents, depending on structural conditions, the particular social and political context, and the personalities involved. Through paying careful attention to the day-to-day experiences of settler-descended graziers and Queensland Parks employees, alongside Aboriginal traditional owners, my research represents an attempt to analyse the nuance, ambiguity, and relationality that characterises land management in Cape York on the ground. Cape York is an appropriate and revealing site for this kind of intercultural ethnographic inquiry because it sits at the nexus of important political struggles, as well as social, cultural, and environmental changes. Cape York's significance as a series of protected bioregions of national concern cannot be underestimated, nor can its importance as a region rich in a diversity of Aboriginal cultural heritage, contemporary lifeways, and Aboriginal cultural and political struggles. The region has been a testing ground for new forms of land tenure, for environmental protection legislation, and for Aboriginal economic development projects. Incidents like the Daintree Road dispute that attracted international attention in the 1980s and controversy around the changes to the Queensland government's Wild Rivers legislation in 2010 have revealed cracks in a so-called green-black alliance between environmentalists and Aboriginal people, as they revealed divergent aspirations between those groups. Such struggles have also brought to the fore questions around what Aboriginal autonomy and self-determination actually look like. The rise and fall of the grazing industry has also transformed the landscape of Cape York, along with the changing socio-cultural makeup of the region. The proliferation of national parks and the handing back of land formerly held as pastoralist to Aboriginal landowner groups, particularly since 2008, have further changed regional relations. Moreover, today Cape York is a frontier of environmental change as the impacts of invasive species, loss of biodiversity, erosion around waterways, rising sea levels, and saltwater inundation are felt. Today, I will be discussing the weed and feral animal control that comprises a large portion of the work that various land managers in Cape York do. As introduced plant and animal species are not always constrained by fences or land tenure boundaries, land managers are aware that controlling these species must be a collaborative and coordinated effort. Different land managers target different introduced species for control in the areas for which they have responsibility, and the ways that certain species are understood as more or less problematic indicates the ways in which land managers understand and seek to order landscapes and reinforce their sense of belonging in it. The methods that different land managers employ in an attempt to wrangle invasive species can help us to understand the changing cultural and social values that shape the goals and practices of the main land managing parties in the Cape. I begin with the discussion of how different land managers approach weed control and how this may relate to the broader ways in which different people evaluate and categorize different aspects of landscapes and how this influences their land management practices. I will then turn my attention to pig control. Pigs are an introduced species that hold different meaning for different groups of people, problematizing assumptions about how species come to belong in Cape York and destabilizing any assumed correlation between nativeness and belonging. I will show that for Queensland parks rangers, weed and feral animal control is largely shaped by objectives of ecological protection and environmental preservation that are mandated by government policies at the time in order to cultivate a native and natural appearing landscape. Graziers too engage in weed and feral animal control in order to preserve and cultivate a particular type of landscape that is conducive to grazing cattle. The way that Aboriginal rangers manage invasive species is contingent and contextual, and sharing some aspects with grazier invasive species control. In my analysis, I examined the different practices and knowledges of invasive species management among these groups. That is, by examining how fauna and flora are understood and categorised by the various land managing groups in Southeast Cape York, I will show how landscapes are cultivated in contested, overlapping, and ambiguous ways. This has consequences for how effective the management of invasive species is and for the outcomes that different land managers are seeking to achieve. The spread of invasive species is of increasing concern for... I can't change my PowerPoint. Oh, there we go, sorry. The spread of invasive species is of increasing concern for all land managers in Cape York. Like much of Northern Australia, Cape York is particularly threatened by the spread of Gambergrass and greater grass, and it is the control of these introduced invasive species that groups like Cape York Natural Resource Management are directing funding towards. For graziers though, woody weeds like the sicklepod you can see on the screen at the moment are of greater concern. Much of the weed control that land managers in Cape York carry out happens towards the end of the wet season. As the cattle grazier named Mike explained to me, this is the optimal time to spray for weeds, as many are only just popping up in the wake of the monsoon and they've not yet gone to seed. If weed control happens after the plant has seeded, it's already too late. On a hot, sunny and steamy day in April, I accompanied grazier Mike on an expedition to spray sicklepod. Sicklepod is classified as a woody weed. It is a variety of the Senna group of species, some of which are plants from America that have spread voraciously through Cape York. Sicklepod shrubs grow up to 2 meters in height and have soft, rounded green leaves and attractive yellow flowers. It's a competitive weed that quickly takes over large swathes of land, spread by livestock, tide threads, boots, and water. Sicklepod seeds remain viable for about 10 years, making the plant very difficult to control. Graziers target sicklepod rather than introduced grasses because sicklepod reduces pasture, whereas cattle can eat some introduced grasses. On this day, Mike and I take out 2 quad bikes and travel to some parts of the property where sicklepod has become problematic. While Mike rides his bike in a methodical kind of grid formation, spraying weeds from a tank of poison on the back of the bike, I wait in the shade. Mike has told me he just wants me there to help him open a few big and unwieldy gates, and in case he goes arse overhead on his bike. Mike tells me that in the past, he used to attack sicklepod more aggressively, spraying in any area on his lease where he was aware it had cropped up. However, the local council, which assists many landholders in weed control, has stopped focusing on spraying sicklepod, and Mike has not been able to keep up the concerted campaign alone. Mike says that he knows he will never be able to beat sicklepod. All he can do is really clean up the areas that he needs to have clear. On this occasion, he tells me he is feeling particularly pessimistic, as a series of medical appointments have kept him down south in the city of Cairns for some weeks, and he has missed the optimal time to spray. He explains that the sicklepod may have already seeded, and he's concerned he's fighting something of a losing battle. Weed control is also a significant activity for the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal rangers in Rinyuri National Park. When I spent time in the park during the wet season, the focus was firmly on lion's tail, which is this plant. Lion's tail is a woody weed from southern Africa. The shrub can grow up to 2 meters tall and has dark green leaves with serrated edges and stunning orange flowers. Lion's tail is sold as an ornamental shrub in many parts of Australia, and my grandmother actually used to have it growing in her garden. It thrives in disturbed areas and along waterways. The ability to spray lion's tail is dependent on the weather, as any rain in the hours after the poison has been administered will wash the plants clean and render the poison useless. One wet season afternoon, I clamber into a buggy with Grant, the ranger in charge, or RIC, for Rinyuri National Park. He passes me a protective face mask and instructs me to put it on so as not to ingest any of the chemical that we'll be using. We are on our way to spend the afternoon spraying lion's tail. Grant speeds down the main road through the park before cutting into a section of bushland. He has a GPS in hand and is zigzagging through the scrub to a plotted coordinate where lion's tail had previously been spotted. We reach a clearing dotted with the tall shrubs. Grant points out the plant to me, describing some of its notable features. He passes me the nozzle of a hose connected to the tank of poison on the back of our buggy and shows me the different ways to spray the weed depending on proximity and the wind. A gentle mist that will coat those plants that are nearby and a steady jet for those plants further away. Even through my mask, the poison has a bitter smell. It fuses with the scent of wet earth from the frequent rain, crushed grass from our bush bashing, and the exhaust of the buggy. Once a section has been sprayed, we mark the area on a GPS and tie a pink plastic ribbon around a nearly established tree to ensure that the other teams of rangers do not accidentally double up and spray the section again. We spend weeks traversing open clearings and thick and swampy undergrowth, encountering multiple punctured tyres and becoming bogged in sticky mud several times as we seek out and spray lion's tail. Usually once one plant is spotted, it becomes clear that a whole area is infested with the plant. Over an afternoon beer, Grant noted that eradication is an unrealistic goal as the plant has a highly successful germination rate and seeds remain viable in the ground for 7 years. Another ranger joked that eradication is a dirty word. He said that he was pessimistic about the possibilities of eradicating any weed. Some of the older rangers told me that they have been trying to control lion's tail for 20 years now, and the footprint of the weed, the geographical area where it is found, continues to grow larger. We sprayed lion's tail consistently for a number of weeks, and these outings would frequently provoke questioning from the rangers about how effective we were. Yet spraying weeds like lion's tail continues to be a significant part of the work plan for Rinyuri National Park, and a consistent portion of Queensland Parks funding is directed towards just this. Graziers and park rangers alike invest significant amounts of time, labour and money in attempting to control weeds. While the purposes of their respective weed control programs diverge, graziers and Queensland parks categorise weeds in similar ways as either useful, appropriate and belonging in some sense, or as problematic, invasive and requiring action. To understand how land managers respond to weeds, it is first important to problematise the categories through which plants are ordered. Bubant and Singh define weeds simply as organisms that proliferate without human planning. They suggest that the term weed need not be a negative ascription, saying that the weeds we identify may be good or bad to the humans amidst whom they thrive. Although they are unplanned, they may become resources for humans. Alternatively, they may hamper resource utilisation, or both. The concept of weed works as a kind of metaphor used to describe a landscape that is disordered. For land managers in Cape York, I suggest that weed control is ultimately an attempt to reorder landscapes in a way that encourages certain landscape attributes that are preferable to particular groups for specific reasons. Graziers seek to control weeds in order to maintain pasture for cattle grazing, an aspiration that is tied to both economics, as cattle are dependent on pasture, and to carrying on a valued way of life, as the social category of grazier is reliant upon grazing. For their part, Queensland Parks Rangers are following policy guidelines which require them to work towards cultivating a natural, which we can read as native, landscape. As geographer Quivstrom suggests, managing weeds is about creating order in a landscape. Such ordering can be understood as preserving or shaping an appropriate or natural landscape. What counts as natural or appropriate, though, differs from land manager to land manager. And as such, it is pertinent to critically consider what the baseline is that we seek to return landscapes to. While only introduced species with invasive behaviours are targeted for control, different species are prioritised by people for specific reasons. In the case of Queensland parks, a mixture of factors determine which weeds are targeted for control. These factors include a departmental requirement to target specific species that have been identified as urgent by Biosecurity Queensland, the observations by on-the-ground rangers, and the region-wide weed management team about weed proliferation, and the outcome of joint management meetings with Aboriginal traditional owners. Queensland parks have obligations to engage in weed control under the Biosecurity Act 2014, the Nature Conservation Act 1992, and the Forestry Act 1959. While these priorities are geared towards an outcome in which the spread of invasive species is mitigated or stopped, the actual practice of controlling weeds remains important for the institutional culture of Queensland parks. This is so even where such efforts are understood by rangers to have little effect, as with the spraying of lion's tail. While a park without weeds is not possible, the effort to control and the aspiration to eradicate weeds is about the preservation of a particular type of preferred landscape. A key aim of the Nature Conservation Act 1992 is to protect the biological diversity of native wildlife and its habitat. Biological diversity is here defined as the natural diversity of native wildlife together with the environmental conditions necessary for their survival. While there is no specific definition given for invasive species, weeds, or ecosystem biodiversity in this Act, the Act is geared towards preserving a loosely defined natural diversity of species. From what I observe of the actions of Queensland Parks Rangers, though, a preferred landscape in this case would seem to be one devoid of introduced plant species. Whether provoked by a desire to protect biodiversity or to preserve the amenity of national parks, weed control by Queensland Parks represents the valuation of a particular type of natural landscape. This goes back to the preservationist model that national parks are based upon and a reverence for a separate and external nature, as expressed in the writings of American naturalists like John Muir. This breeding of landscapes as wildernesses necessitated the exclusion and erasure of people who used and relied upon such landscapes for subsistence. Indigenous people were erased and excluded by the Yellowstone model of national parks, and this practice of dispossessing Indigenous peoples for the purposes of conserving landscapes is evident across the world in a variety of different contexts. The exclusion of Indigenous people from this model of conservation is significant because it negates the human role in the distribution of species and the creation of landscapes. These exclusions help to create the myth of a natural landscape untouched by human hands. In order for the landscape of the national park to appear natural and aligned with the imagined wilderness sought by tourists, a great deal of human labour is necessary. Weed control is one aspect of the enormous amount of labour that goes into ordering the landscape, resulting in a landscape that appears to be wild and untouched. The way that graziers approach weed control indicates a similar aspiration to preserve a particular type of landscape as that found amongst Queensland park rangers. Although in the case of graziers, this preserved landscape is a pastoral one. For graziers, the actual act of weed control is less significant than the outcome. Graziers seek to ensure that they have sustainable pasture in order to continue running cattle. Hence, the focus on woody weeds over invasive grasses is logical for graziers, as it is woody weeds and not introduced grasses which threaten their pasture. While acknowledging that introduced grasses do pose a threat, especially in terms of impacting on burning practices and bushfire risk, graziers assert that because cattle eat these grasses, they do not require immediate action. Instead, graziers are more concerned with the spread of woody weeds which compete with and ultimately greatly reduce pasture. Groups like Cape York Natural Resource Management and Cookshire Council previously provided financial aid and assistance to landholders to attack woody weeds, but the recent focus on Gambergrass has resulted in funding being redirected. Without this financial backing, graziers have shifted their method of weed control to instead focus on areas where the growth of these weeds makes it difficult to carry out their work, spraying around sheds, gates, and yards. While plants have generally received less attention than animals in multi-species ethnography, Galvin advocates for a more fulsome attention to human-plant relations. Describing studies by Braverman and Dove, Galvin suggests that plants in these analyses do things in both the ecological and the social realms. Indeed, just as animals like cattle and sheep have functioned as colonial agents, so too have introduced plants been used to reconstruct landscapes for political and economic purposes. Plants in Cape York also do things. Gambergrass, initially planted as pasture for cattle at the encouragement of the Department of Primary Industries, disrupts existing fire regimes with its high fuel load. Sicklepod competes with pasture, threatening graziers' livelihoods and exacerbating tensions between graziers and Aboriginal ranger groups, Cookshire Council and Cape York Natural Resource Management. Different weeds and their various impacts make precarious the established forms of land management that exist in the region, particularly for graziers. In this sense, plants bring into being new frictions, tensions, and relationships among humans and between humans and landscapes. As the spread of invasive plant species continues, aided and abetted by a changing climate, land use, and an increasingly mobile human community, weeds and land managers are likely to become more intertwined. Just as it is apparent that introduced plants do things in the lives and relationships of Cape York land managers, so too do animals. The most significant invasive animal species in Cape York is the pig. As with invasive plant species, pig control precipitates the discussion about what belongs in the region and how species shift between the categories of belonging and not belonging as a result of economic, environmental, social, and cultural values. Feral pigs are a strong focus for pest control in Rinuri National Park. Pigs are exceedingly common and can be incredibly destructive. Aboriginal ranger groups and Queensland parks want to control pigs because of the damage they cause to sensitive wetlands. Wetlands support populations of water lilies, water birds, and other animals, and are often significant story places or sacred sites for Aboriginal traditional owners. The rangers and pest management team employ a number of different techniques to control pig populations, including trapping, baiting with 1080 poison, aerial shooting, and nighttime shooting on the ground, aided by an infrared scope. As the ranger in charge, Grant, told me, pigs are clever, and many, particularly the older boars, know to hide when they hear the sound of a helicopter, which makes them difficult to shoot from the air. Grant explained to me that nighttime shooting appears to be ineffectual if one only considers the numbers. But if the shooter is able to target and kill a small number of problematic pigs, like those older boars, it can still be useful. One of the specialist pest management rangers explained to me that there are a few issues with baiting. 1080 poison, sodium fluoroacetate, is used widely across Australia to target introduced animal species. It's a useful poison in Australia because the acid form of fluoroacetate is known to exist in 30 species of native Australian plants. This means that many native animals in Australia are not as susceptible to the poison as introduced species are, and if administered correctly, 1080 impacts on non-target populations can be minimised. Although some animals present in Australia since before colonisation are not susceptible to the 1080 poison, dingoes are. 1080 is distributed through lumps of meat that have been injected with the toxin. The pest management ranger told me that in the past, they had used aerial baiting in Rinuri National Park, dropping the poison-laced meat from a helicopter around the park. This was effective because they could cover a large area quickly and access places that are not easily reached on the ground. Now, though, this ranger explained, they can only bait on the ground in specific areas. This is because of the potential for the baits to kill dingoes. As well as being a protected species inside of national parks in Queensland, dingoes are a totem for some of the Aboriginal clan groups that are traditional owners for the park, and the accidental death of dingoes is unacceptable to them. The cessation of aerial baiting in Rinuri National Park has also been frustrating to neighbouring graziers, who have noted an increase in pig numbers since the pig control regime in the park changed in accordance with traditional owners' wishes. Grazier Allen told me that he believes pig management needs to involve a cohesive effort from all neighbours, as pigs do not respect land tenure boundaries. Pig control tends to be everyone's business in Cape York. For graziers, the most significant issue with pigs is that they churn up the soft mud at the edge of waterholes and dams, transforming these areas into boggy wallows that can be quite dangerous for cattle, particularly as they weaken towards the end of the dry season. As Bill, a 60-year-old grazier, explained to me, we've got man-made waters, dams, and you get a mob of pigs hit a dam and root up around the edge, get an old skinny cow going in there, next thing bogged, Bill's wife, Diane, nodding, tells me. And we get them good, cleaned out. When it gets really dry everywhere else, they all come for our dams. Pigs in Cape York are considered virtually across the board as killable. In some instances, the killing of pigs alongside weed control can be considered part of a purity project. This is particularly true of Queensland Parks, which as an institution seeks to return Cape York to a pre-invasion, pure site of natural nativeness. For the killing of pigs to be characterised as extermination, eradication, or control, pigs undergo a reclassification from non-native to invasive, and finally to pest. By considering pigs as pests, they are not only deemed killable, but they are attributed a negative agency. While obscured by the scientific discourse of environmental management, pigs are characterised by, in particular Queensland parks, rangers and graziers, as willfully causing damage and exhibiting deviant behaviours, when in reality, pigs are behaving exactly as they ought to, fulfilling a biological destiny to dig, root, wallow, and consume. Pigs are considered to be particularly deviant when they go about their business on cattle stations and in national parks. Yet, despite their classification as killable pests, and despite a concerted effort by a variety of land managers to reduce pig numbers, pigs remain an intractable part of the Cape York landscape. As with weeds, there is a resignation among land managers that it is unlikely that Cape York will ever be truly free of pigs, but the desire to control pigs is related to the valuation of particular types of landscapes. Among Aboriginal traditional owners, pigs occupy a more contingent and contextual space, in which they exist not only as killable pests, but also variously as an economic resource, type of pet, and source of recreation. In this sense, pigs emerge as disrupting an assumed correlation between nativeness and belonging. Pigs are considered by many Aboriginal people, including the Lama Lama and Kuku Taipan people who are traditional owners for Rinyuri National Park, to be an important bush resource. In describing the bush and marine resources on his country, one young man made no distinction between native animals and pigs, describing them all as important parts of the diet of Aboriginal people living on outstations in Cape York. Once, driving through Rinyuri National Park with a Kuku Taipan woman named Donna, we discussed pig control. Donna asked me if pigs were introduced or native species. It seemed to me that she was fairly sure they were introduced, but just wanted to confirm. Her confusion is not unfounded, though, given the length of time that pigs have been present in Cape York and their importance as a food staple to Aboriginal people in the region. Several people in Cape York refer to wild pig populations as Captain Cookers, indicating a belief that these pigs are descended from the several pigs that Captain Cook released at the site of present-day Cooktown in 1770. However, the consensus among the scientific community of Australia is that it is unlikely that pigs arrived in Cape York in this way. Much more likely is the widely accepted explanation that feral pigs in Cape York are descended from escaped domestic stock. This is based on the fact that the earliest reports of feral pig sightings in the region occurred in European explorers' journals in 1847. Regardless, pigs have been a part of Aboriginal people's subsistence and lives for a long time. For Aboriginal people, characterising particular species as belonging in Cape York does not always correlate with nativeness. Rather than emerging from robust scientific demarcation, the category of nativeness is often defined as a species that has emerged or spread with an absence of human intervention. A sometimes arbitrary and rigid temporal threshold is appointed, with all species present before a particular moment in time considered native and all species arriving afterwards deemed alien. However, as Leslie Head points out, this temporal threshold is contingent upon how long humans have inhabited particular land areas and how much we know about human history in these land areas. In Australia, the threshold is considered in the natural sciences to be when Europeans colonised Australia. This is a slippery kind of threshold, though, if we consider colonisation to be a structure and not an event. Moreover, as described in various scholarly works and popular literature and the media, selecting this threshold negates the influence that Indigenous people in Australia have had on the distribution of plant and animal species pre-European colonisation. There is evidence in the archaeological record and the writings of early colonists of the intentional domestication, distribution, tending, and harvesting of various plant species by Aboriginal people pre-colonisation. Thus, the temporal threshold referred to in the biological sciences is both logically flawed and problematic, as it works to construct settlers and settler-descended people as outside nature, while locating Indigenous people firmly inside it. These categories contribute to the long-held trope of Indigenous people as noble savages, who possess static, unchanging environmental knowledge, a falsehood that has been used to justify the dispossession and control of Indigenous people and the appropriation of their lands. Pigs are understood by Aboriginal people to belong in Cape York in some sense. However, Aboriginal traditional owners understand that pigs need to be excluded from specific sensitive areas like fragile wetland ecosystems and story places. Pigs, along with other introduced animals and plants, can be read as unintentional non-human colonizers. Like human colonizers, these species have spread into new landscapes, altering ecosystems and both enabling and imposing new relationships with the humans and non-humans who already lived there. However, unlike cattle, who Deborah Bird-Rose describes as the four-legged soldiers in the army of conquest, pigs were not intended by settlers to aid in outnumbering Aboriginal people in order to take control of their land. Instead, pigs were brought to Australia where they have no natural predators and escaped the bounds of how they were originally intended by humans to behave here, along with other invasive species. To Aboriginal people, pigs are not simply a pest animal to be controlled. Instead, they are an important food resource, which also has the potential to be destructive to sensitive areas and ought to be excluded from these areas. Pigs then are considered by Aboriginal people to contingently belong on some level, and in some places in Cape York. Such incorporation of an introduced species by Aboriginal people is not unique to pigs in Cape York. Other authors have noted similar instances across Australia in which introduced species such as donkeys, camels, and horses are sometimes incorporated into cosmologies and sometimes, as in Cape York, in ways that are mundane and practical. In Cape York, humans, native species, and non-native species coexist in various ways as a result of colonial penetration through interspecies dependencies and more hostile forms of relating. The spread of invasive plant and animal species can be understood as a slow disaster that precipitates new forms of precarity as land managers seek to wrangle these species in order to preserve particular landscapes. While it may be appropriate to frame the spread of invasive species in Cape York as a gradual disaster, this is not the whole story. In relating to invasive plant and animal species, some land managers engage in forms of collaboration across difference. These collaborations, which are contingent and contextual, are clear in the relationship between llama rangers and pigs, who they relate to variously as pest animals, as a food resource, and even sometimes as pets, like this picture of this little pig. Pigs exist in Cape York as a direct result of the colonial project, but Aboriginal people in Cape York have formed a relationship with pigs that Donna Haraway may call an unexpected collaboration and combination that results in making odd kin. The categories by which plants and animals are ordered are culturally and socially important, and as Head has suggested, can reveal much about human bounding practices. Through the deployment of categories like native and non-native, introduced and invasive, feral and pest, species are situated as belonging or not belonging in a region. The description of these categories spreads into practices which work to order landscapes in particular ways related to how different groups of people understand, rely on, and relate to land. As with all landscapes on Earth, Cape York is a hybrid landscape impacted by human activity and the global movement of resources and species. Alexis Shotwell has argued that environments all over the world are already contaminated. She writes that we are living after events have changed and frequently harmed ecosystems and biospheres. As Buband and Singh have suggested, some anthropogenic landscapes are not solely of human design, but emerge as a result of the cascading effects of more than human negotiations. Pigs were intended to provide a domestic food source for communities of settlers. Liontail was intended as an ornamental garden shrub, and Gambergrass was originally intended to provide stock feed. Each of these species has seeped beyond the confines of their imagined and intended existence, trickling into new geographies and ecosystems and accumulating weediness along the way. Bubant and Singh refer to these spaces of new kinds of unexpected relating as being imbued with feral dynamics. Cape York is a situation rife with these feral dynamics as humans and non-human species are brought into unintended relationships that sometimes represent collaboration and often result in a human effort to exert control. What these introduced plant and animal species do is disrupt an assumed correlation between nativeness and belonging. The categories that different species are ascribed differs from land manager to land manager, just as notions of what a preferred landscape or appropriate use of land is changes depending on who you ask. Relationships between humans, non-human plant and animal species and landscapes are contingent, contextual, and continually co-produced in intercultural and interspecies assemblages. Such relationships are frequently informed by economics, as in Cape York, landscapes, labour and livelihood are intimately entwined. When people go to grapple with invasive species, the economic relationship to land is part of the grounds of encounter. This is because it is through making a viable living on and with the land that people are able to form meaningful attachments to land and craft meaningful senses of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marty. That was really good. Yeah, we can go to some questions now, or any discussion points anyone might have. Feel free to pitch in or say something in the chat or anything. Or stick your hand up if you want to say something.
Jamie, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Joe. Sorry, I was muted.
Hi, Marty. Thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I'm going to perhaps prod a little bit around stakeholder views. Okay, I'm so glad that you went beyond the spatial and into the temporal around when we consider things to belong and not belong. I think that's a really important point to make. And we tend to have, a pre-1788 perspective on this, but of course we know that that's a falsity. We know that dingoes, for example, arrived from Asia 3,000 years ago, and in fact are, in some senses, introduced species. Okay, and so I think you actually really talked very, very well about that incorporation, that particularly in the cosmology dimensions of how Indigenous and First Nations peoples incorporate these things. But what I'm interested to know is, you spoke about, and we tend to have this when we talk about animals, right? We tend to think about the temporal dimensions of animals, so dingoes and pigs, which you elaborated. But did you get any insights from your stakeholders around when they see or sense weeds to belong or not to belong?
I think there's definitely introduced plants that are not considered to be weeds that have weedy tendencies in Cape York, things like tamarind, banana trees, mango trees. So they're considered to belong. They're really useful plants. Everyone eats them. And, bush lemon, things like that, they're weedy because they're often just spreading without any human intervention. But they're useful and people eat them, they use them. Even Gambergrass, which I didn't speak about in a lot of detail today because I didn't quite have time to fit in all the weeds. But Gambergrass is a species that it's this sort of like tall pasture kind of grass. And until really recently, the Department of Primary Industries was really pushing for graziers to plant Gambergrass as improved pasture to feed cattle. But Gambergrass is one of the species that has spread all over Northern Australia and causes severe disruptions to burning regimes because it has a really high fuel load, so it burns really hot, and it contributes to these sort of bigger bushfires than that region is used to having. So Gambergrass has only recently, and still only in some regions, switched from being this species that Department of Primary Industries and graziers want to plant and spread to being a species that people are trying to control. And there's still kind of a bit of a battle in some regions of Northern Australia where the Department of Primary Industries is still suggesting people plant Gambergrass, while a different arm of the same government is trying to remove as much Gambergrass as possible. Things like sicklepod and lion's tail, they're sort of focused on by graziers because they impact on pasture, as I sort of said. In terms of national parks, their focus on weeds a lot of the time seems to be kind of a top-down decision. So certain weeds will become a weed that they focus on, like lion's tail, even when it looks like they're not going to achieve very much by continuing to spray it. Does that answer your question?
Okay, does anyone else have any questions?
I will ask a question. Thanks, Marty. That was a really, really, really interesting talk, and it sounds like your fieldwork would have also been incredible. I know that Deborah Birdrose writes about in her donkey paper about the land being the one that chooses who or what is belongs. Could you speak more about the relationship between utility to humans and belonging in as we, I suppose, we're the ones using these categories, so they're human-centric by design, but perhaps just speak about that thing of if a thing is useful, then it belongs, and if it's not, then it doesn't.
Yeah, I guess my analysis is really about these social categories and these cultural categories. As to whether plants can kind of belong somewhere when they're introduced is, I guess, a bigger question that certainly a lot of ecologists are kind of looking at. This idea of landscape sort of shifting into, as like a complex adaptive system, shifting into a new basin of normality. But in terms of the idea of belonging, I think it is very much a kind of social idea. And in Cape York, it does tend to be really related to utility. It does tend to be related to people's economic relationship to the land, I think. I don't know if that really answers your question.
I don't think that question has an answer, but it is definitely interesting to think about. Thank you.
I might ask a question if I could. Just following on from that, you talked about weeds and talked about animals. What about people? Are they categorized in terms of the extent to which they belong? And I'm thinking obviously historically of Indigenous, non-Indigenous, but also as the road up to the tip has been improved in recent times, there's been, at least pre-COVID, there was a big increase in tourism, and I guess tourists bring undesirable organisms with them as well. Is that part of the discourse?
Yeah, definitely. Questions around who gets to belong in Cape York was a really big part of my thesis, not so much in this chapter, but in other parts. And there is still, definitely a divide between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Cape York. But I think the kind of more pertinent and interesting distinction is between sort of like locals who are Aboriginal traditional owners, but also these kind of multi-generational settler-descended grazing families. The distinction between these locals and people who are not locals and are from down south, which is generally Queensland Parks employees, except for the ones who are traditional owners. So even Queensland Parks employees who have lived and worked in the region for 30 years would not consider themselves to be locals. And it's quite a sort of political thing because their relationship to the land and their sort of knowledge of the land doesn't come from this embodied experience, which is really highly valued by both Aboriginal traditional owners and settler-descended graziers. And tourists are kind of a whole other situation. But yeah, the sealing of the road definitely has a lot of people concerned that there's going to be a lot of rubbish in Cape York.
Yeah, were there any other questions or comments from anyone? I don't have anything in particular. I'd just like to say thank you. It was a really it's an interesting talk. I thought it was very well delivered. I'm not used to coming from a science background, not used to the kind of the descriptions of field work that you gave. It sounded really good. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure can.
I'm pretty familiar with this with this work, but Marty, thanks so much. It was really great to hear you put that work together today in a paper. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about you mentioned this onslaught of tourists and their expectations and the way the park is having to also orient towards the expectations of the tourist experience up there. I just wonder if you could say a bit more about that. It's, pretty interesting about how the tourists are responding to this environment in Rinuru and what sort of things they're doing there.
Yeah, I think Parks is very much geared towards facilitating visitor access. A lot of their weed control, I didn't go into it a whole lot in the paper today, but a lot of their weed control with things like Gambergrass is about preserving the amenity of the park. There's a particular plain in the middle of the park called Nifold Plains, which is sort of this big, large, flat expanse with these like towering termite mounds that's currently sort of shielded by this wall of Gambergrass, which means the public can't really see this plain that's kind of, it's on these tourism brochures. It's one of those really iconic sorts of places. So in their weed control and in their pest control, parks are really concerned with how it appears to visitors. I think it's probably not so much of a, like tourists aren't so much of an issue for graziers, except when it comes to pig hunters, which I also didn't talk about today. But pig hunting is a very popular pastime for a lot of people who travel to Cape York, people from towns further south like Mareeba or Townsville, or even further south than that. And national parks have a huge problem with trying to control pig hunters who are seen as quite disruptive to parks. They do all sorts of things that are really illegal, like they drive off the track, they have dogs, they have guns, and they're exhibiting antisocial behaviour. So parks sort of spend a lot of time and resources trying to focus on controlling pig hunters, like maybe as much time and as many resources on controlling pig hunters as they do on controlling pigs. And the situation is a little bit different on cattle stations. Often pig hunters, if they have asked for permission, they'll sort of like pay a little bit of money to the grazier, and they're pretty happy for that relationship to exist. And the same on parts of Aboriginal freehold, and even within some like bits of land that are Aboriginal cattle stations, where it's a bit of a different relationship. And as long as that permission is kind of asked, people are able to have pig hunters on their property, and they're fairly happy for that to happen. Does that answer your question, Linda?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot of the people that go there for those sorts of activities are going to care whether it's pristine wilderness or not, that's not really an audience that the parks is orienting itself to.
Yeah, maybe more so in terms of visitors passing through the park, like the people kind of going up to the tip and back, then it's perhaps more where they are like wanting to see the park as they've seen it in a brochure. And then like seeing pigs is disruptive then to these like beautiful wetlands and to this kind of expectation of what they're going to encounter when they come to the park.
Can I ask a question, Jamie?
Well,
I mean, I was thinking when you were, as you were talking about this kind of created environment, a new ecology or whatever you want to call it, not that you're actually quite saying that, it was making me think about the Amazon. Because, kind of research evidence on the Amazon, particularly by archaeologists and botanists and so on, has shown that it's actually very largely anthropogenic.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, we think of the Amazon, apart from all the crops and so on, as being, kind of pristine and so on. But the evidence is quite clear that large parts of it are based on extensive, long-term sort of, agricultural practices long before, colonization. So it just, I mean, it's more of a broad comment than anything, but it seems to me that what you're talking about really fits into that literature. It's actually quite common in areas like forestry, in disciplines like, is it a discipline? In sciences like forestry, where people are sort of saying, well, actually, there isn't any such thing as a pristine natural forest. They're virtually everywhere in the world. There's a huge anthropogenic influence.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the work of like William Ballet in terms of cultural forests in the Amazon, and that's definitely a huge factor in Cape York, especially in terms of the fire regimes, which again I didn't speak about today, but I have a chapter on that in my thesis. So kind of the Savannah landscape of Cape York is one that has become fire adapted and even fire dependent based on thousands and thousands of years of a very specific Aboriginal burning regime, which continues in a slightly different form up to the present day. And we see now that kind of ongoing burning regime is invested in now in Cape York in a kind of interesting way through the carbon sequestration scheme. But it's definitely a landscape that is very clearly a cultural landscape, an anthropogenic landscape as a result of this millennia of firing the landscape. among other things.
Okay, excellent. Were there any other questions from anyone here or comments? Or
I have a personal one for Marty, if she wants to answer it. Marty, did you go up there just for your fieldwork, or is that where you're from? Like, how did you situate yourself in this, like, navigating all these kind of like amorphous boundaries of identity categorization, which is, I suppose, what it all comes down to? How was your fieldwork experience?
Yeah, I did just go up for field work. I first went up in 2017 to try and scope out the region. North Queensland is where my grandma's family is from. Like, I'm in Queensland right now. And I didn't have much of a relationship with Cape York itself, but I grew up in a rural area that's not cattle graziers around my parents' place, but it's a lot of agriculture and cropping. So I've kind of always related to farmers, wanted to kind of work with farmers. And I was interested in working in a joint management context that also, outside of the formal structure of joint management of Aboriginal traditional owners and Queensland parks working together, but also joint management as encompassing also cattle stations and different forms of land management. So, yeah, I don't have a particular tie to Cape York, but yeah, I now do.
Yeah, definitely not necessarily. It's just so interesting how that, like, research of belonging and not belonging also comes into it really. Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
If I can comment there, I think, one of the achievements of this project of Marty's was just the, doing this ethnographic study on such a scale with such diverse groups of people. And, I think, the sort of basically the working within a big government bureaucracy and the National Parks and Wildlife, and then, right through to the, these sort of fairly fragmented graziers on these large properties, and then the Aboriginal traditional owners. And I mean, I was fortunate enough to be with Marty for a week up there, and the distances you have to travel just to see a person is just to have a casual conversation, or let alone interview somebody. And it was really quite extraordinary, the effort that had to be put in and the time just moving around that extraordinary landscape. So yeah, one of the more challenging PhD projects that I've had the pleasure of supervising, I must say. And I think, Marty, there's quite a lot of methodological innovation that you developed, through doing this research that also needs to be written up and talked about. It's worth a paper in its own right.
I would love to hear more about that, but I see that perhaps I'll message you.
we got 2 minutes, Hannah, if you want to ask now.
Yeah, Marty, do you want to like cram all your methodological insights into 90 seconds? No.
I mean, I guess the kind of the thing I wanted to do was to not focus on just Aboriginal groups or just on non-Aboriginal groups, but to kind of look at these kind of like these intercultural spaces and these zones in which people kind of co-created environmental knowledge and sort of co-managed the land together. And yeah, I feel like I was very lucky. I sort of just popped up at places and luckily people warmed me enough to let me do research with them. So I started with one Aboriginal ranger group, and then I met the chairperson of another ranger group, and so I worked with both of them and the cattle stations adjacent to their properties, which were all these cattle stations were all sort of part of an extended family national parks were a bit more complicated to get, to be able to work with, but got there. I'm not really sure if that answers much of your question at all.
It's okay. It is very interesting.
Yeah, it certainly is. I think we can probably wrap it up there. Once again, thanks a lot, Marty, for a really great presentation and a really fascinating project. And thanks everyone for coming along to listen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. Great talk.